Hi, everybody. Harmony Bench. I'm really excited to be here with you all. The past couple of years have been insane, right? So I wrote a book. That was fantastic. It's called Perpetual Motion. It came out in March 2020, right when the US shut down, so that was awesome. But it was also fun because, well, I don't know if it was fun, but it was also one of those moments where it was like, this could be really, really good or really, really bad. And I think it was really good because it was basically kind of the prehistory of all of this dance occurring in online spaces. Just as people were like, oh crap, where are we gonna do our dance now? And so that felt pretty good. I convened a conference last year. This is Where We Dance Now, COVID-19 and the New and Next on Dance on Screen. That was also pretty amazing. It was my first Zoom-only conference. And many, if not all of you, I think were there. And then the other stuff I've been working on, it's been a busy couple of years, but I'm trying to get another new project underway that's really thinking about screen dance spectatorship, and particularly a kind of sense of a somatically embodied spectator, and what's kind of the language of sensory experience in viewing dance on screen, in terms of how we might broaden or shift notions of kinesthetic empathy coming from the kind of live dance situation and modifying those for a screenic context. So I'm talking about something I call kinesthetic affects or synesthetic affects, and really thinking about how the movement of the camera and the movement of the dancer are kind of these complementary forces that also impact the viewer in a somatic way. So those are some things that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gabri Krista, and what am I doing right now is today's the last day of the Moving Body, Moving Image Festival. This year around the Moving Body with Disabilities on Screen. It's my third edition. While also actually Trinity College is 2 years ago, I did the Moving Body with the Aging Body on Screen. That one was in Dublin last week. So it's been a busy time. We did a live session with 3 screenings and installations in the Movement Lab with Katrina's work in it. Today it's the last day online because we also go online, so it's a social justice festival. It's been so busy, it's like my head is kind of spinning with everything that's been happening, and I really feel that the pandemic changed a lot of things for me. It's like you said, like it was busy, but I started finally filming myself. Even though I teach camera, I started picking up the camera kind of as I had nobody, so made 2 films. One is also involves projections and archive, and I've been busy with that. I wanted to actually really write about it for the journal, but that will come in 2 years, I think. It's one of those things.
Everything takes time.
Yeah, just to really think about how to use archive in the body, on the body, and that's a film. A short experimental bio doc. I didn't know it was a short experimental bio doc, but I've gotten that language from a programmer at Sundance who said, this is a really great experimental documentary. And so I've been researching experimental documentaries as a form. And I've been enthralled, and I said, yes, that's actually kind of what I do to begin with. And wasn't really aware of the form, and it's been very, very, very exciting. So I spend a lot of my free time watching experimental documentaries right now. And it made me also think about the power of representation, because as a woman from the Caribbean, it was really important to see people like Catherine Dunham, and I felt like, oh yeah, I can choreograph and come up with my own ideas. But what I've been lacking until today, actually, I still don't have it, is just the other black females being behind the camera, not just directing, but picking up the camera, being a nerd. And that part has been so exciting for me to do and to investigate and think about. And I started picking up the camera and be sort of doing the second thing, but that's a whole other thing. Well, we can talk about that a little bit later, in how to direct and pick up the camera and all of those things. I'm not very clear, but I'm gonna stop talking about it. And I'm working on a really big, hopefully my big feature, which I'm gonna start shooting in January if I get enough money. But even if I don't get enough money, I'm still gonna be shooting, and that's in Suriname. Yeah.
I'm Kara Hagen, and let's see, it's been busy for me as well in that I'm getting to the tail end of watching submissions for ADF's Movies by Movers, where I've been for 7 years, and I've been with Movies by Movers before it was ADF's Movies by Movers for years before that, so this is actually my 13th year doing Movies by Movers. I just had a book come out in February of 2022, Screen Dance from Film to Festival, Celebration and Curatorial Practice, which is a little bit of history and a little bit of curatorial memoir and a little bit of, well, a lot of questions, actually, burning questions that I have about screen dance and about people participating in screen dance, about the values that we hold as a community. I've just finished an article that marries several of my loves of dance, screen dance, pop culture, and it's about Black sitcoms and dance in Black sitcoms specifically as it relates to dance on the minstrel circuit. And man, I just really love that work, so I'm going to go further into it and see what happens. Because it's one of the coolest articles I've ever written, in my opinion. And I don't say that about my work a lot. And then I'm at the very beginning stages of an edited volume that centers screen dance festivals and screen dance festivals telling their stories, because we really lack those stories in the field. And I learned that writing my book, which I was like, oh, nobody's talking about their festival in a deep way. We should do that as a community. So I'm trying to create that space. So if anybody wants to write something, let me know. That's me.
I'm Claudia Kappenbach, and I've shifted quite a few things in the last 6 months professionally, in that I've stopped teaching on the MA at the place. I've also stopped teaching undergraduate moving image at Brighton and taken more a senior role in sort of strategic development of the fine art area. And that's freed up my own creative juices in many ways, which has felt really nice. But I've just flown from the UK to here, feeling very much that I'm flying in the opposite direction of the war that's going on in Europe. And it's incredibly upsetting. And so what's coming up for me is a lot. My German past, growing up in Germany and being very much part of a continental dream of freedom and peace and learning everybody's language so I could go around and be anywhere in the world. And experience a continent without borders. And then, of course, this happens. And so I'm finding at the moment I'm mainly spending my evenings looking at the news, which maybe is not a good idea, but I can't help it. Feeling like I need to kind of witness what's going on. And in Europe, everybody at the moment is just asking why, why is this happening? So we are going back to history and asking, where did it go wrong? Did it go wrong? You know, which red line did we step over, or did we not? Which promise did we break, or who broke a promise? Or would Putin have done this anyway? You know, we're steeped, or I'm finding, you know, myself and everybody else, we're going back into history and asking all these questions. And they suddenly become vibrant, vital questions. You know, they're about survival, really, in terms of the future of Europe and the world, perhaps. And it's affecting everybody. It's affecting everybody's food price. It's everybody's energy. It's the outlook. Germany's taken on about, I think, 150,000 refugees so far. Moldova, a little country of 2 million people, has taken on 4 million refugees so far, roughly. So it's really crazy what's going on there, and it's, you know, it raises so many questions. And then thinking, where am I with my work, my art? What are the questions we are asking? What are we contributing? What are we saying with the work? Of course, raises huge questions. And so I'm feeling like my question that I'm bringing, that I have with me is, you know, how do we screen dance history? You know, there's so much in screen dance in terms of embodied being, in terms of topographies and communities, that we need to say that. And what can we say, and how can screen dance tell something about these histories that other people haven't been able to say, you know, in terms of what we can contribute. And so that's a really big question for me at the moment. And at the same time, I digitized some tapes, which I have had for some 30 years, from old dance classes, which I did with my dance teacher, Hilde Holger. He was a Jewish refugee from Austria, who had a solo career in the 20s, then had to flee the Nazis, go to India, dance there, then had to flee the religious wars in India, went to London, and then taught there until she was in her late 90s. And I spent sort of the last 10 years of her life with her, performing her work, learning from her, going every Saturday to do her classes. And I've got about 3 years worth of footage in beautiful little Video 8, shaky camera, glitchy stuff, shot against the window, God knows. But there is this, we've digitized it, and it's absolutely beautiful. You know, there's this 90-year-old woman sitting on a chair, can barely move, can barely come down the stairs, but she's teaching us how to dance, you know, with hoops and sticks, and comes up with new ideas all the time. So I've got a sabbatical now, thankfully, from the university to make a film about her, which is going to be something about this creative space of what dance and this work can hold within or against the crazy world in which we live, and what she had experienced, you know. She had to teach underground for a year in Vienna to save her life, lost all her family. So, I mean, this is, you know, history is very raw at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm Katrina McPherson, and it's interesting just hearing what Claudia was saying there, like a sort of immediate sort of perspective of where I am right now as well. And I realise, as is often the case, that life kind of brings you to a place, and you're not, you know, you find yourself ready for a moment in a way that you didn't think you were going to be. So, you know, like many people, you know, I had a very busy kind of first 18 months of the pandemic, teaching people all over the world on Zoom, and it was all like amazing and interesting. And it felt, you know, I sometimes thought to myself, this feels like a different sort of front line, because, one was connecting with individuals that weren't able to meet anybody else, and they were by themselves with their iPhones in little spaces in Argentina and China and India and all over the place. But that was the first 18 months. And then partly through choice and also partly through circumstances, really for the last 9 months, I haven't been doing any teaching, a little bit of mentoring. But it's created this space that I've been able to really attend to my own practice again. And actually the most kind of important work I think I'm ever going to be making is the one that I'm kind of in the middle of. And it's also about my German heritage. It's about my German grandmother, who was a refugee from the Russians in 1945, leaving Berlin, and with my mother and my aunt, who were children. And she took her own life in 1946 by walking into the sea. And that was the story I grew up with. And it's really only been in the last couple of years that I've started to think about how can I respond to that story through the art that I make. And so I've been working on that project a little bit up till now, using the photographs that remain of her. The one thing she took with her when they didn't take anything out of Berlin, she stuffed her pockets full of family photographs. So we have those photographs. So I've been really kind of embodying her in my body and filming that. But in a strange sort of way, the war breaking out in Europe has kind of stopped me in my tracks slightly, because I feel, not that I don't want to make the work, but I just feel like, wow, suddenly this is all becoming a very different story, because it's, you know, my mother's still alive, so she, as an 89-year-old woman, is hearing about, you know, the fear of the Russians. She grew up with that fear of what was going to happen when the Russians arrived in Berlin. And the idea of war in Europe again, which, you know, is something we've all grown up with, believing and hoping it would never ever happen again. And of course, feeling shame about things like Brexit, and all the other things that may have contributed to that. So, although life is a huge struggle right now financially, because I think as artists as well in the UK, it's not a great time. It also feels like actually maybe this work potentially could really start to matter in a way that it hasn't possibly mattered before, or maybe that's only my perspective on it. And I think as you get older as well, I'm certainly feeling, you know, I'm, you know, reflecting on my practice, and it's partly through doing a PhD by Published Works, where I've had the opportunity to sit and look and work and talk and think and write about it. You know, I guess you also realise that you might not have very much longer. This might really be the last piece of work, which is something I've always thought every time I've made a piece of work, but, you know, thankfully so far it's not been the case. But this really feels, so it feels like a very important moment to be sort of noticing what that is going to be. So I feel kind of really happy. Well, I'm very happy to be here, to be able to have these conversations. I also feel very sort of aware that it's very important what the next step is, and how that might be done in a way that can be as useful as possible to the world. Feels important. Yeah.
Definitely. Yes. Wow. Hello, everyone. I'm Omari Motion Carter, and I'm so excited, too excited to be here. Yeah, what I've been up to? Well, I finally graduated from my MA in screen dance, and I went to the graduation, and I put on my gown, and I walked down that aisle, and I shook hands with many beautiful people. So I'm very happy to have finished that and finally got a chance to graduate from that. And now I've been hired as a lecturer at the school where I did my master's. And so I just feel like I'm feeling this new sense of love and privilege that I have to be in this space to invite and to give information. And there's a lot of talk now about decolonizing the curriculum and all these sorts of things. So right now I'm just trying to be a sponge to it all and take the space and see how I can influence what can potentially be the way we look at dance on film in the future, bringing in all the new references. And of course my studies come from within hip-hop dance practice. And so I've always felt like there's many ways now that hip-hop can tell so many beautiful stories through the form. And when I say hip-hop, I'm talking about dances of hip-hop culture. And of course, lots of people have a single story for hip-hop. And the word urban, which is something that I look into quite a lot. What is this word and what it means? And so, yeah, at the moment, I'm running a course in screen dance there at the university, inviting other lecturers to come in and give the students some different sides of the practice and different forms of the practice. And yeah, like with lockdown, we made like 15 films with the Motion Dance Collective. It was like the busiest we've ever been. We became VAT registered, all these crazy things started happening. And so, but then I was thinking to myself, right, well, you know, when everyone makes their second film, then we're going to be in. Because what was happening is that a lot of people were just transposing their theatrical work and getting into film. So it was a lot of teaching going on. A lot of kind of helping people understand what is this mishmash between the two worlds. So yeah, I think I just feel so honored to be here and just kind of to be able to talk and offer my perspective on what that is, coming from a potentially urbanite sort of world. So yeah, very excited about what's to come and what more we can discuss and yeah, the future that we can't see but we can shape. So yeah, that's me.
Good. Okay. Hi. I'm Marisa Zanotti. And it's really great to be here and see many people that I've only ever seen on Zoom or have only seen on Zoom recently. I'll talk a little bit about what I did in the pandemic because, like many people here, I feel it's really changed a lot how I approach working. Like you, I just recently, well, in the last 2 years, started shooting my own stuff. But during the pandemic, I worked with a group of 25 older dancers every week for between March and the middle of July. So that was a weekly class teaching them to make films. And we created a sort of document of that process, which went from the beginning of lockdown to the end, pretty well, to the end of that sort of phase. And that was a really amazing sort of experience. Because it was a large group, it was on Zoom, and we were really making it up. So that was quite a sort of a, yeah, it was a great thing to do. It's a piece of work I'm very proud of. I had recently left my job just before the pandemic started, so I was all of a sudden a freelance artist again, and that has really kind of it's funny you're saying life comes around. I was a freelance artist for 17 years and then I got a job in academia, and now I'm like in my late 50s and I'm a freelance artist again. And it's a different world, but it's really good. I made a very big project about the Ballet Giselle, a big digital archive. Yeah, there's that. This year I've been also really busy. I've started making my work, kind of configuring my work for outdoor projection. So I'm kind of making very big scale work now. So work that exists both on for phone screens, so really working in a portrait form, but that's for projecting on very tall buildings. I've just been finished co-directing a live work and making video design for it. And my project that I'll be talking about tomorrow is a documentary, a sort of creative documentary which has been commissioned by Broughton Council, Broughton's the city I live in, that documents a building that I live in, that I work in, which is a building shared by artists and small tech businesses. It's an industrial building and it's in the middle of a kind of area that's being regenerated. So all of a sudden I'm in this space where I'm kind of part of witnessing something else and witnessing that regeneration, but also the council have commissioned it as a way of understanding the community and the community in it, which feels really exciting. And Katrina and I had this conversation yesterday. And I guess there's something about in the pandemic, and this feels quite sort of ironic to be saying this, but I thought I'm going to work local. So I've come to America to tell you I'm going to work local. But anyway, I'm going to work more locally. I don't really know what that means yet. So I was working with these old people who are living quite near me. I'm now working like 5 minutes from my house in the area that I live. And all those things feel kind of important in the way that they're not global, but they're actually a way of creating models for different ways of working, for different ways of effecting change. For me, as somebody who's been working in dance and screen dance and filmmaking for 35 years, to go, actually, this is something else. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ann Cooper Albright, and unlike the rest of you, I've never been behind a camera. And I don't even like to be in front of cameras. I've never even taken a video of my kids. So I always come to these discussions in a kind of odd, tangential way. But I first got involved with the whole Screen Dance Network through my work on Loie Fuller. And I'm really interested, so I did this book on Loie Fuller. I had a lot of feminist film theory in my background in discussing representation. And now, these days, I'm very interested in kind of thinking about the role of screen or early video in 1970s, right? Because I'm doing this big celebration of the 50th anniversary of contact improvisation and the ways in which that early 70s had these very clunky but interesting video formats, and people held them right? So, sometimes they go upside down, and there weren't, kind of rules about the right way to do this kind of filming. And I recently was at the Getty, which came out with a new book on, the first book actually on Blondell Cummings, who has some very interesting early video work. And I was just thinking to myself, there's a really great essay to be written by someone about the way in which that early video had an impact on how people danced and that conversation back and forth. Because in early Contact, when they got in 1972 to the Weber Gallery, they had Steve Christensen taking those videos, and they looked at them all the time. Which is, so I would say that's, for me, interesting. But the other thing is, unlike the rest of you, I never stopped teaching in person. We actually continued. We have a very big studio. We de-densified the classes, and we had mass. But I was really interested in what happens when the form that I'm working in kind of takes space in between, right? So I do contact improvisation, which is usually about physical touch. So I started to really experiment with what happens when that touch becomes rhythmic, visual, kinesthetic in a certain way. And so I started really thinking about all of these new forms of contact, and that in some ways isn't completely separate from thinking about how, you were talking, Harmony, how one affects something across distance, which I think is what happens in Zoom if we use Zoom in an interesting way, right? So a lot of times I found myself being asked to do something on Zoom and wanting to break out of the format, wanting to kind of find a way to get in and out and energize, rather than allowing the screen to kind of keep you in this very, kind of slightly formal, slightly detached, but how do I do that? How do I find a way to move? The other thing that happened to me, so before the pandemic, I came out with a book called How to Land Finding Ground in an Unstable World. And that work actually had, like your work, had a kind of interesting resonance. So during pandemic, people started calling me up or asking me to do yet another Zoom something or other, podcast or whatever it is, that kind of looked at, well, what happens now that the world's falling apart? And the most recent chapter in that is this new war. And you were talking about history, Claudia. So my son does Russian politics, and my husband does Russian literature. So our family has huge, long conversations about Tolstoy, about Putin, about the history, about cyclical histories in Russia of coming together and going away. And so much of my work, whether it's in Contact or whether it's the How to Land book, is about how do we connect? The question of othering, the question of being together or being separate. What's the role of screens in that? How do screens connect? How do they unconnect in some ways or pretend to connect? I'm very interested in that. What's tactile? What's available to us when we, because I think one of the things that happened in Zoom, Harmony's conference was great, right? Zoom allows for this connection across physical distance. That's amazing. There was also a Zoom conference on the future of contact improvisation that was pretty horrible, actually, because Zoom also allows people to really get stuck in their own perspective. Right? So you just have lots of perspectives, but the sharing that happens, think if we were right here doing this on Zoom, because we could be doing it on Zoom, right? But it's a very different relationship if we're filming something in person. And so I've been, spending the last 18 months funding and then preparing for this week-long 50th anniversary celebration of Contact that has workshops and panels and an evening of film, you'll be happy to know, and performances and the underscore, and then a final town hall. But one of the things I felt very strongly about as a dancer was the first thing, everybody dances. Then we have conversations. What happens after we've moved together? And then we can talk about fierce subjects. We can talk about race and contact. We can talk about all these different ways in which contact pretends to be open but excludes people. But you talk about that after you've been moving together. Ooh, I got goosebumps. All right. You talk about that after you've been moving together, and those conversations are going to be different. You talk about that on Zoom, and those conversations have a hard time going anywhere else, you know. So for me, you know, and I think that my role in this Screen Dance Network has always been to be a little like, yes, but, yeah, right, let's remember the body. Let's remember what happens when that kind of, and I don't think you can't film that, but you film that a different way, you know. So that's where I am at the moment. Yes.
I am going to speak. Thank you. I'm not sure. There's so many things I want to say. And again, I want to keep saying thank you all for actually taking the leap of faith to be here, because I think what you just said, Anne, about, you know, being in space together is sort of my mantra. I've just organized a conference previous to this where there was another 50 or 60 people here. And it feels like kind of a coming out, or, you know, like coming out into the light or something. Suddenly people are saying, okay, I feel okay about this. Maybe not totally okay, but I'm going to do it. And here we are sitting in this tight circle, talking about the war in Europe, which now I'm feeling emotional about that, and things that everybody here has brought up about gratitude and about kind of how this has shifted, how the last few years have shifted your practice, how age has affected some of you. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The idea of the local that Marisa brought up, I'm going to also talk about that. Blondell Cummings, you mentioned. Actually, I'm going to talk about her a little bit later. You know, I've been looking at Blondell Cummings forever on screen. So there's a lot swirling in my head right now. So I'll just say that, let's see, what will I say? I've spent the last good year, at least, or more, trying to organize this event with the help of a lot of people, and a lot of great support. In terms of my own work, I was on sabbatical this year. Well, let me back up one thing, because people have talked about what they did sort of during the pandemic. During the pandemic, for 8 months of it, Xiaoping was off in San Francisco taking care of her mother, and we live out in the country here, and so I was alone in the country for 8 months by myself, and it was fine with me because our studio's there. There was nowhere I particularly wanted to go. I was teaching from home, teaching a couple seminars from home, and so I had a lot of time to think and to just sort of be in my, actually, really be in my body in a very quiet space. And so that led to a project I think we started shooting it in December of that year. In the sort of really in the middle of the pandemic, I had been thinking a lot about the kind of project I wanted to do after having worked in this field for a long time. And I really thought that I wanted to sort of close the circle a little bit after shooting and pointing the camera at people who weren't me for a really long time, to kind of come back to my own body and to a way of working that I had worked in really from the 70s, late 70s, all the way to the present. So I decided also to be very articulate to myself about what I wanted to achieve, and to be accountable to all the things I'd asked other people to be accountable to over the years. So I really sat down and thought a lot about what that would look like. And so the final thing that I think I was really concerned about was that I wanted to make a film, make a project, whatever that project was, that was made as if this was the last project I would ever have a chance to make. So what would I what would I want to be in that project? What would I want to do? And so the project started off, had a couple iterations, but it's called Song of Songs, and it really is inspired is not the right word, but suggested by this biblical poem called the Song of Songs, which is a very kind of ostensibly erotic poem about heterosexual love. And of course, that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but I took that as a kind of starting point. And so I did put myself back in front of the camera, and I worked with a cinematographer who I'm very close to, and has shot a lot of work with me. I felt very comfortable in the space. We were masked up until the time we shot, and then everybody agreed that it would be okay to be unmasked in this. It was a very large space. And we spent, I think, 3 days or so in the dead of winter shooting this piece, both interior mostly, and then some outside. And the things I wanted to talk about in that piece, and things you all have talked about already, are some ideas about vulnerability, sort of the aging body, in particular my aging body, my vulnerability, legibility, which comes up a lot, and I think sometimes, although you mentioned you're working with older dancers, who's legible, who gets to be legible, things like that. Advocacy for some of those ideas. And also this idea of witnessing. I think I felt like I heard maybe Omari use that term, or somebody's used that term earlier. And I think we'll hear a lot about that in the symposium. This idea of just witnessing, just sort of being available. And to a certain extent, what Anne just said about Zoom, which we could talk a lot about, but the kind of witnessing I feel is happening right now in this moment, as we've gone around this circle, is very different than what happens online or in other places. That's, we can talk about what that means. And for those of us who make screen dance, who make work for the camera, I think there's also a way, I think this group would agree, that there's a way to employ the camera in the service of witnessing as a kind of proxy for the viewer, and to do that in a way that gets to those places of vulnerability or legibility or things like that. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that in the symposium. But I'll mention a couple of things. So that film that I thought I was making as if it was the last project, which in fact I did, has been touring around, and I've been following it around to different places in the world. And that ultimately it will be screened in a conversation and an event at the Bergman Center in Faro in Sweden, excuse me, in the context of a conversation about collaboration between directors and cinematographers, Sven Nykvist in particular. And that film is a bit of an ironic or a happy twist for me, because so much of that film for me was about me sitting in the dark watching Bergman films, and other films certainly. But that kind of like intense personal vision that in those films in the 70s that you're talking about now was kind of available to us. So the last thing I'll talk about is subsequent to that project, then I actually had another project come up. It was a commission, and Marisa talked about, I think, the idea of working local. And this is not a local project, but it was a commission that came from Decatur, Georgia, from an institution in Decatur, Georgia, and they said, we'd like you to do some kind of film project down here, or here, on a building, on the front of a building here, and what would you like to do? And I thought, well, Decatur, Georgia, boy, there's a lot going on in Decatur, Georgia, in Atlanta, and thereabouts these days around race and around politics and a lot of pretty intense stuff. So I said, well, I'd love to do that, but I'd like to come there, and I'd like to have you identify a group of people who are doing things for their community that no one knows about, who are adding value to people's lives in their own community that will never be legible, really. And I would like to work with those people. And that, coupled with a particular monument in Georgia, which is a very large mountain, and on the side of the mountain, this is a few miles from where this project is, on the side of the mountain are etched all of the Confederate generals. And it sort of stands over the community. And I thought, well, I wanted to do something that sort of spoke back to that a little bit. So I worked very closely with this group to develop a series of personal gestures from the group. We actually started very much like this, in a circle. asking people to recall and to share some of the gestures that have been sort of part of their life, their family, their history, and then built that into a kind of an index of personal and shared gestures. And then each person performed in a space that was completely equitable. In other words, everyone has the same background, everyone has the same screen time, everyone has the same lighting, everyone has the same dimensional space in the final projections, on very large projections outdoors in this public square. And the title of the piece, which I didn't know until I got down there and worked, ended up being Monumental Gestures. So it plays sort of against the idea of gesturing towards a monument, about a monument, and also sort of making legible very intimate physical things, bodies, people, the gestures of individuals in a very kind of monumental way. So that's the most recent project I've worked on. And I think that's probably a good stopping point.
Well, it was just once, thank you everyone for speaking, because I find so many overlapping interests, right? The aging body on screen. I forgot to mention I'm editing a journal, Scholar and Feminist, around the aging BIPOC body on screen, and definitely also who do you foreground, thinking about histories and how do you portray it. And then also what I was writing when I was singing is just basically foregrounding the humanistic elements of the digital. And how do we do that? How can we feel those histories? How can we feel the trauma from whomever it is, right? And how then does the trauma manifest in the body, and how do we then share that on screen? It's more questions I'm having, and even the histories, because most of my work have dealt with histories and aging people and colonialism and the ramification of that. And then sitting here thinking about what you're dealing with, what you're talking about, and just feel super emotional about it too, because I started making screen dance because I didn't feel that I actually could do that on stage anymore. So I thought about how can I do that with film, and then I also realized I'm so experimental, I can't really tell a straight story. And I don't like it. And how can you then communicate, right? That's really a big question that I'm having, but that I feel there is a lot of overlap in that. Doesn't go anywhere, but that's just what I'm hearing, and I'm deeply curious about. And how can the archive and the histories help in that, and how can you make even the historical archival material, if you use that, how can that feel alive and not just as a documentary, which I tried to do with my last film, Sheila, with projections. And then in my other work coming up, the bigger part is also dealing with dance and trauma and the body, but as an idea of how people can still have dance in their body, or that comes from their families, or even trauma in the body, which we know is also a thing that is inherited, right, with the back from the Kolk's book and that. So yeah, that's really curious about how that can work on screen and in this form that's experimental, and how do you communicate, and how do you then still hold on to this beautiful hybrid form without going into a straight up documentary form. That's kind of what I'm hearing and grappling with, honestly. Yeah.
And I think something that's coming up for me as you're talking, there's a lot of pieces of writing and things that are in my head. Like I'm thinking of Judith Donath, and I'm thinking of Sherry Rabinowitz, and I'm thinking of Laura Knott, all these people who have talked about or made about humanizing this digital space and what it means to be humans using a digital space to express ourselves and to connect in some way, shape, or form. And having been on Zoom these past 2 years and thinking of all the ways that there's been a consciousness raising on the part of the masses because of our forced slowdown, right? And thinking more about how our bodies exist in our lives, in the spaces that we occupy, in the spaces that we don't occupy for whatever reason that may be, if we choose not to occupy those spaces or if we're not allowed to occupy those spaces, and how we move through spaces, right? How we cross borders, both real borders and borders that are imagined and borders that are invisible. And in thinking of screen dance as this space where, for me, it's a dream space, right? This place where we can say, okay, well, the laws of physics don't apply here, right? The laws of time don't apply here. And if nothing else, even if we can't get to a point where we can have people feeling like, okay, this is a human experience that I'm having watching this piece or engaging with this piece, that we can at least say something about this idea that, okay, yes, in the physical world, we're fixed. There are rules that we can't really break, but let's break them anyway, at least in a metaphorical sense, so that we can start to have these conversations in a more expansive, dreamlike way, instead of the way that I feel like we have them in real space and on the news and in these places where it's like there isn't a lot of wiggle room to say, let's reimagine how this happens. Let's think of the spectrum of experience that is happening on the planet right now and find some way to distill it into some gem that we can do something with in this moment. So,
The dream space, I think it's something that I've been thinking about is a very interesting concept and something that I think screen dance by and large is quite good at, to dream. And there is I feel like I have a sense of there's a lot of can-do on screen, which happens within screen dance because we can do it, because there's a choreographic confidence, because you can use spaces in different ways to how you would normally do it. So this is a really wonderful aspect. And at the same time, I'm thinking, what about the real space? Yeah. What about the real histories, the real boundaries, the real institutions where the power is? How do we speak to power in some ways? And we need to also learn to do that. And that's a very hard task, I think. But it feels, I sort of have a sense that there is maybe two sides. I mean, I don't want to create a binary here, but there is a dream, a need for dreams and the imagination for reimagining this, absolutely. And there is a need for understanding or engaging with the real world in some ways.
yeah. And speaking to that, I think that we're feeling that tension all the time. So as a woman of color working in screen dance and knowing from a numeric point of view that most of the films that come from Black folks are about the Black experience, where do we get the space to say, okay, well, let's make something that's not about that as a way of pushing up against that which is in the real world, right? And so I think that, for example, when I see Omari's film about joy, we get so few films about Black joy, like so few. And so I see this Omari's film that you showed yesterday as an ingress, right? As a space where you're saying, okay, this is the world that I'm given. And the art world expects us to create work specifically about what exists, specifically about the trauma that we can't get away from. So I think sometimes I completely agree with you. And I think, yes, we do need to have space to talk about the real world, but also there's something to be said for having the real world be something that we confront, for lack of a better word, or I don't know what I want to say about it. I need a word. Somebody give me a word. But we do it because the real world does not afford us the space to be in that dream space, and being in the dream space means that we are doing the work of being in the real world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like, I heard there's an artist in London called Freddie Opoku-Ade who said, if I made more work about Black trauma, I'll probably be more popular. Like, all the funding applications are about issues and cutting edge things, and it's like so monolithic. Like, I see so many angry Black bodies on screen, like all the time. They're either screaming or upset or sad or something's happening. And even when I was studying, I thought, okay, I'm gonna pick up some of the Black books now, because they weren't on our reading list, right? Like when we were looking at a lot of the things we get spoon-fed these practices that we should look at. So I'd walk past the books because it was like, that's not on my reading list. And when I started to pick up all the books about black dance, you go through the trauma of it all, like there's so much going on. And I was like, wow, like how can I create balance in that? Like, and so that's always been my goal, like to create balance in the images that we see. And like Cara talks about it a lot, right? There's a lot of films about black people talking about black things, or disabled artists talking about being disabled. But why can't we just have a black woman do a magic trick? You know, right? And there's so many stories that a lot of white bodies get to tell that I won't get the funding to be able to tell. So it was actually I paid to do the masters to get permission to make that sort of work. I don't think I would have been able to do it for a client. But I don't know, maybe I can. But it's one of those things that now I'm actually going, right, I can actually shape the practice and not go, oh, these are the rules of film or these are the rules of dance and I must follow those. It's like, no, let's break it and kind of look at all the different parts of myself, yeah.
So I want to respond to what you said, Omar, about making the work you want to make, not being, and I'm kind of trying to quote you, not being able to make the work, and also Cara's sort of idea about pushing back against that space in some way that you were having trouble articulating what that was. But Marisa and I think we were talking earlier about this, and Marisa, tell me if this is correct, you mentioned a film that you had made, or some films that you had made that had been shown at one or two festivals and then put on the shelf. And I'm having that, I have had that experience making certain films that I really wanted to make that weren't festival friendly in a way, the new pieces that way. But what I'm trying to say, I think, is that, and I'm going to say something about this later, that, you know, making the work that we want to make is where we should be living. The festival model, I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I think we'll talk about it this week too, is not necessarily friendly or supportive of those ideas. And there's a huge history in the art world, in the history of the art world, about what's called the salon refusé, which has completely disappeared. If there's a show in an institution on the boulevard that is all of the accepted work of art, there's a show right across the street of all the work that wasn't accepted into that show that is pushing back very publicly against them, and that we've kind of lost that in a way. Somebody, I don't know if I heard someone say, I think you were saying something about trouble, or I don't remember how people describe this, but this kind of idea of just pushing back, you know, pushing the boundaries, pushing the edges. You don't like that festival? Create a new institution. We were a little bit, I think we got a little bit relaxed around all the opportunity that was being presented to us if we fit into that particular mode.
Doug, I'm surprised you say that. I wonder, because we do have the fringe, you know, there's fringes everywhere, very big fringes, like in Brighton, the fringe is bigger than the actual festival. So there is a huge culture of fringe. So I'm wondering, maybe you were talking about the screen dance field itself, because the screen dance field itself is the fringe to large. So I'm not sure we need a fringe to the screen dance fringe. But there's sort of this idea that here's the main show and there is no more other. I'm not so sure.
I was just thinking about this being unapologetically yourself in work also. And I was also thinking, when you were speaking and when both of you were speaking about black space, you know, in that space there has been experimentalism. So maybe we could distinguish sort of the mainstream and the non-mainstream, because what is happening, in my view, in screen dance, there is sort of a taste and a more mainstream way of looking at screen dance, where maybe other forms that maybe are more experimental or pushing the boundaries or don't feed into a certain narrative are now not as accepted, but there's more work being done than when certainly I started 20 years ago. There is a lot of work. And then also looking at music, you know, there's experimentation and joy and all of that. So maybe we shouldn't be looking at screen dance as the example for expressing ourselves, whatever we do. I certainly don't in that sense. Like what's in the other fields, and you look at the art world. I always feel that there is a space for everybody, but it's just figuring out where that space is. So do you all want to be in that main space? I certainly don't think so. As somebody from the islands, I see myself as a cockroach, meaning there are always like the spaces in between where the crumbs fall and where you can operate. So what is that space and where is that audience? Because not everybody is going to like that work, and not everybody, because there's also the curator, so there's always the fringes and the, maybe the cockroaches, there, these spaces in between where there is a space for the work you do, I think, or any one of us does. So I think that maybe it's just a problem with institutions to begin with, I dare say, a little bit, and then being written about and being accepted in. Yeah, but there's a whole section of people always trying to figure out who don't belong in whatever that field is, right? So there are great ideas about that, I think.
I wonder if it's a case of when you belong in a field. Mm-hmm. I've always felt very cheered by sort of hearing these tales of somebody brilliant screening at Anthology Film Archives, and there was like 45 people watching it, or 10 people watching it, but I'm still watching it like 40 years later. And I think also there's something about just the importance of finding a way to make your work, and not falling for the idea that you need to be in lots of festivals or you need to have lots of views online, but that you need to make it and keep it and look after it. And, hope one day that, it's a body of work you're making. It's a body of experience that you're collecting, and it just may not be seen just now. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it in our different communities, in our different ways. And I think that's kind of really important. I also think there's something about looking, we've all said this at different times, the importance of looking outside of screen dance for your models. There are so many filmmakers of colour over the years that have made extraordinary work that speak to lots of different experiences, and looking to them and finding out about them. I can't speak to a black experience, I can speak to different, I can speak to an Italian white experience, and I can look to my filmmakers that are perhaps not so well known and find out about them and see myself there. That's it.
I was going to pick up on, I was going to also use that word experimentation. That seems really important to me. And it's going to be one of the real challenges as screen dance does become more embedded in institutions, particularly educational institutions. I think it's going to be really interesting. Tonight, this panel with ACDC, I always want to say, but it's not ACDC. It's the other one, yeah. Although it could be with them. That's good. But it just, that is going to be the challenge, because where you'll also lose voices, individual voices, is in the sort of codification of what it has to look like. And I mean, having taught in the American university system, I know how easy it is for that to happen, that certain boxes have got to be ticked for a piece of work. So the people who are going to be moving forward with that are going to have to be really careful with that to allow experimentation to exist. I think that's one thing I feel. And then also I was just sort of musing on this notion of filmmaking as being something that distances us, whereas my personal experience of making films is that it brings me closer to the subject, that in a very, very physical way. So this feels to me more like making a film than a Zoom call does, and it's maybe not surprising I haven't made any work on Zoom because I didn't feel that didn't feel anything like the thing that I'm used to. I'm used to this, and then what that negotiation actually brings out, and I suppose for me that's why it's infinitely fascinating, because it's as infinitely fascinating as every single encounter that you have with another human being. So it's not finite. Those are the two things that I feel like I'm also hearing like other people are kind of thinking about as well and experiencing. So it's a really interesting place to be at, actually. And And can I just add one thing as well? I think it was easier in a way to be experimental before, like in the early days. Like if I think about when I started making whatever it was called, video dance, like I didn't actually see any work for the first 6 years, because how could I? There were no festivals, there was no internet, you know. So I read about Maya Deren, and I read about, you know, Yvonne Rainer, and I went to see Tarkovsky films, and I knew about Derek Jarman. And I sort of melded that into my own understanding what a voice might be in my voice, in my screen dance, video dance voice. But I had no idea. So in a funny sort of way, although as a teacher, I'm always like constantly looking for not new, but new to me works to share with students, because I think that is an important part of what we're doing. And as you say, challenging the kind of the norms of what's shared and et cetera, et cetera. But also there's a part of me that sort of feels like, don't watch anything. Just make what you know, experiment with what you know, what's of interest to you. So,
well, I think there's an interesting nexus here between history and the way in which screen dance carries the legacy of modernist approaches to dance as being precisely about unique voices, expressivity, and most people don't want to spend too much time looking at history because they don't want to know what other people did, because then they don't feel original, right? So there's that cycle. There's this very interesting discussion about experimentation and expressivity and the way in which identity gets knitted to bodies or experiences, and the way in which experimental work can maybe question or intervene into which identities get sutured to which bodies, like Black identity getting sutured to a certain kind of Black body. And what can movement, and then potentially movement of bodies and movement of films, because you have like multiple questions of movement within that, do to break some of that up. But then also in screen dance, you have the history of watching screens, which includes TV, Bill Cosby, you know, includes all of these different ways in which we naturalize what we see on the screen. So the question of representation and the way in which screens could cover over sometimes the decisions, the intentional decisions about position, you know, all of those things get evaporated. And then another kind of current that we're talking about is this question of popularity and the way in which, you know, hits, right? Like, what does the internet do to screen dance or dance, you know, on your phones, on TV, all over, that kind of buys into this very capitalist notion that the more people like it, the better you are. And what happens when, you know, people intentionally, potentially, refuse to go those routes? You know, what would it mean, for instance, to have some kind of digital archive that you actually had to go someplace to see, right? Because immediately when we say digital, we go like, and it's available for everyone. You can just go online and see it. But what would happen if, like, when I went to the film archives in Paris, right, to see some Loie Fuller bits, you know, you had to walk into the musty space. You had to go through you know, like, you had to have that experience that might be slightly different from just calling it up on your computer. I mean, I saw Mayfield Brooks did a piece, Whalefall. The first time I saw it, because it was Abram Arts, but it was during COVID, so the first time I saw it was, you know, buying a ticket and getting the Zoom link. I had Mayfield at Oberlin for a week-long residency when we could do it live, right? And we projected it in a big screen in a theater with other people radically different experience. Radically different experience. Now, taking that experience, the meaning of the images and people's size and the collective experience in the theater will inform how I might want to write about it, even if I go back to the film, were I to do that. So it just feels like there are kind of lots of these interesting questions that are arising that circle around one another. And I think it's time for lunch.
Well,
I just had a quick pushback to what you were saying about looking at black films as a person. Because for me, what I have grappled with as a person who has a blonde, blue-eyed mom, who my dad is Chinese, African, Jewish, etc., I foreground brown bodies on screen because I don't see that enough, but not necessarily that it's all about the black experience. I think it would be great if everybody then started looking at black films, because you were saying, oh, well, you can look at black films. But I'm like, no, because my examples, I have Russian cinematographers. I love Fellini, Maya Deren. Who was influenced when nobody's writing about that? Nobody talks about her. Surrealism comes from her being deeply embedded in voodoo and her ways of looking at film, right? So that's this white Ukrainian woman being deeply influenced by voodoo. So I actually want to say right here that what you just told me, I was like, no. Because most black films, are also highly traditional. It's like, and for a reason, probably, because also to tell the stories of trauma, etc., and I'm deeply interested in that. But I also think that opening up the field and looking at Trin, really, there's so many interesting Vietnamese. So I am actually don't believe that, and I really wanted to say that I don't think is something to say. It's good to know it, it's good to make local, but I think just opening up to the variety of ways in which stories are told, or in the African continent. Ousmane Sembène, there's so many fantastic filmmakers in other continents who kind of really tread experimentation and other things. It's more who are your kinfolk, and your kinfolk are not always the people that have that same color. What I was referring to is that as a person, woman of color, behind the camera, holding the camera, that part is what I have not felt, right? So that was like, oh wow, I'm producing, I'm directing, I'm writing, I'm dancing, but I teach camera, but I haven't picked it up. So that was more the representation, and very specifically to that for me. And
to speak to that particular representation a little bit, these award shows, like the Emmys and everything, they have hardly given out any nominations for black folks in non-acting categories, like hardly any at all. And so I think, to speak to that a little bit, some of this is about uncovering some of those histories that have been lost. Early filmmakers, where you have black filmmakers who will never be known, and disabled filmmakers and Jewish filmmakers and other folks who didn't make it into Hollywood, right? Who had these pieces that don't exist anymore because the medium didn't hold up. They got burnt, they got lost, they're in somebody's basement somewhere getting flooded and, can't play them, whatever it is, right? And these ideas that a lot of the stuff that hasn't come into the mainstream that needs to, like Maya Deren's influence of voodoo, that is very apparent when you start to look at it. And if you know Dunham's work, Dunham is in her work, right? But it's not something that we're talking about enough at all. And then going back, like you mentioned, Cosby, right? And this idea that, yes, okay, on the surface, we have this amazing black family with a doctor at the helm and, all these things. But at the same time, sitcoms are super problematic, and places that are really amazing, both and, right? So it's like, to really begin to get to a place where we can open the field, to get to a place where we can have different types of work showing up in these spaces that are becoming more and more homogenous because of the popularity, like you mentioned, Katrina, where we're having people who are teaching this art form, and then you have a group of undergraduate students and all their films look the same.
Sorry.
You know, I mean, but those of you who teach know, you know what I mean. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Or you don't, or you don't, because give the opportunity to experiment and really challenge the form, they will. But the problem is going into this kind of system where people are graded and so on, they can't afford to experiment. And therein lies the problem for me, the world over, I'm sure, is the sort of education systems we have in place.
Yeah.
You know.
I think those of us who are like pushing back at those educational systems, like saying, okay, I'm not going to grade this. No. Like, I don't grade their projects.
No, me
I don't
neither.
grade them. But still, because of what they think people want to see, and I think that's a big thing in American institutions, and we'll probably talk about it at ACDA thing tonight, but like students think there are certain things that you as a professor want to see, which is not true at all. But back to my main point is that to get to the point where we can talk about screen dance or any art form for that matter, the way that we're wanting to talk about it in this circle, there's a lot of recon work that we have to do to get there. Do you know? Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to come back to a couple of things. One, because Maya Deren and her work with Vodun and Catherine Dunham has come up. I just want to say that I have an essay that was recently out in Screen, which is looking at the Verrier of Night, specifically through the lens of Maya Deren's own writing on Vodun and her viewing of Gregory Bateson's films from Bali, looking at those two together as kind of structuring that particular film. So I just want to say, it's one gesture, but I agree that those deeper histories of influence need a lot more work, I think, across the board, but I think certainly in the histories that get written and told about dance film, we have a lot of work to do there. I also wanted to kind of touch on this idea of codification and the institution, because I think a lot of us are kind of caught up in or have been caught up in the institution of academia. Some of us are caught up in or have been caught up in institutions called festivals, and those are responding to very different circumstances and needs, right? The festivals get their funding in relationship to how many likes, how many clicks, how many audience people are there, and so they're responding to a certain kind of mandate and programming their work accordingly. In academia, we have an overinflated sense of ourselves, I think. So Katrina, when you're kind of gesturing to the codification, young people come to us with an idea already of the codification of screen dance. It's actually our job to uncodify, because they've spent so much time looking at how movement is conveyed or pictured or represented on screen. They already come with their cliches, and so it's not even us kind of trying to help them through the cliches that we thought we taught them, but the ones that we didn't even teach them. So I think that there is something about that spirit of experimentation but also that spirit of composition, and being able to teach young people to look at what they see on the internet, online, on TikTok, on whatever, on Snapchat, whatever, with a critical eye, but also with a compositional eye. And I think that it's also incumbent upon us, when we language screen dance, that we are actually languaging screen dance and not reducing screen dance inevitably to dance film. In other words, for the past 20 years, we've been trying to have this open space, open container, any dance on any screen. Thank you, Doug, for framing it in that language. But then when we turn around and just say screen dance is dance film, it does a disservice to actually the multiplicity and the creativity of all the kinds of dance on screen that are happening out there. And we're not going to see those in festival context, because festivals are programming dance film. They're actually not programming screen dance. So I think that that's just something for us to also think about.
And the thing I want to mention is this quote by Trinh T. Minh, which is, she talks about this part of her practice, which is not speaking about, but speaking nearby. That's how she frames it. And I would encourage you to look it up in its context, but it's a perfect sort of way to think about all the things people have been talking about. one of my takeaways is the question of how do we sort of expand these ideas around X, Y, or Z. And Trinity Minha would say, by not speaking about, but speaking nearby.
Yeah.
So I wanted to add that.